Well, hi folks, and welcome to the fourth video in my Getting Started series for the game B-17 Flying Fortress The Mighty Eighth. Now in this video, we're going to run through the first in-game tutorial, and that's accessed by going to the New Game panel on the top left, clicking on the Continue switch in the lower right, and then selecting the middle right-hand panel to choose a training mission. And again, clicking on the Continue switch in the lower right, and then selecting the first training mission, number 1, Taxi and Takeoff. So as it says here, this is the simplest of training missions. It's simply an exercise in taxiing the B-17 and then performing a takeoff. Basic ground handling skills as well as knowledge of takeoff procedure will need to be demonstrated. Once you attain 1,000 feet, pull in your gear and raise your flaps in order to end the mission. Now I'm actually going to run through this training mission 3 times in this video. The first time will be the simplest and easiest, and that will be perfectly valid if you've got the game's general difficulty setting set to low or medium. The second time is going to be a bit more difficult, and it's going to take into account some of the engine management parameters. And so this applies only when you've got the general difficulty of the game set to medium. And the third time is going to be the most complex, and it's the procedure that I would recommend if you have the general difficulty of the game set to high. And one thing I just want to touch on here is that the advice here, it says once you attain 1,000 feet, pull in your gear. That's actually really bad advice. From what I've read and seen for the B-17 training information of the World War II era, was that the advice would be to raise your gear once your wheels are clear of the ground. And this is obviously to minimize drag on the B-17 during takeoff and the initial climb. Another reason was that the training materials cited that in an emergency during takeoff, you're much safer to do a belly landing than to try and do an emergency landing on your wheels. Similarly, it says to raise your flaps at 1,000 feet. What I would actually recommend is that you have your flaps fully retracted by the time you reach 1,000 feet. Now, just a couple of things to point out before we get going. Firstly, I would just like to clarify that any of the 3 examples I'm presenting here will result in the training mission being a success. The reason I'm presenting options is because you need to be aware that if you have the game's general difficulty setting set to high, then a more detailed taxi and takeoff procedure is required to ensure that you don't cause damage to the engines from mismanagement of engine temperatures. My second point is that you always have the option in the game when starting a mission to simply let the AI taxi and take off for you. For convenience, this works great. However, if you do set the game's general difficulty setting to high, then I do recommend that you manually taxi and take off. That is, until you're certain that the AI pilot and co-pilot have enough experience to manage the engines effectively. Now, a manual takeoff can also be a little bit more fuel efficient than letting the AI do it, although in the majority of cases, this will be a very minor consideration. Personally, I love manually starting up the B-17 and manually taxiing and taking off. For me, this really sets the tone and atmosphere for a mission early on. I normally only switch to AI control once I've reached the forming up location at 2,500 feet. Anyway, without further ado, let's get on with the training mission. Let's start with the first and simplest. And we'll proceed to that by clicking on the right hand lower switch here, Play Selected Mission. Okay, when you first start this training mission, you're taken to the pilot's action view to start with. Now, as this is the simplest example of taxiing and taking off, I'm actually going to take us to the external view because it's much easier to taxi from that viewpoint. So I'm going to press the F2 key to take us there. Then I'm going to hold down the left mouse button and just rotate the camera view around so we get a better view of where we're going to taxi along. And then I'm going to press the right mouse button, push the mouse forward to get a bit of a zoomed in view on the B-17. Okay, so now we're going to run through a pre-taxi checklist. And the first thing to do is to make sure that your throttle control is set to 0. And the reason for that is because the next item is for us to switch away from AI control to manual control by pressing the M key. And if our throttle control had been set above 0%, we'd have seen a response from the engines and the B-17 might have actually started to run away from us. So it's quite important that you make sure your throttle is 0 before you switch to manual mode. Now we're going to check that we've got a response on the controls on the B-17. So first of all, we're going to check the movement on the ailerons by moving our joystick left and then right. You can see we've got a response on both ailerons there, which is perfect. Now we're going to check the elevators. I'm going to push the joystick forward and pull it back. Great, we've got an elevator response. Now I'm going to check the rudder movement, and on my T-Flight HOTAS X I rotate my joystick to do that. That's what I've got the rudder controls mapped to. But obviously use whatever rudder controls you have set up for testing this piece. So twisting left and twisting right. Perfect, the rudder's working. Now the final piece to check are the throttles, and before you do that you want to make sure that the parking brake is set. So I'm going to press the P key on the keyboard to make sure the parking brake is set. I'm going to move the throttle up to about 50%. See the throttle and engine response, and I'm dropping it back down to 0 again. Perfect. So all of the controls are working fine. Now, before we actually start taxiing, I also have a couple of last items to do, and that's really, I just want to touch on a couple of oddities in this training mission here, in that the wing flaps are shown as fully extended. Now if you go to any of the ordinary missions in this game and you're at this point where the engines have been started and you're about to taxi, you'll notice that the wing flaps are fully retracted. And in actual fact that's the correct position for them at that stage. They should be fully retracted. So I suspect that in this training mission they have them fully extended simply so that that's one less thing for you to have to worry about doing. But just bear in mind that really these should be retracted at this stage before you start taxiing. And in the next two examples of this training mission after this particular segment, I will actually go through the process of retracting those flaps because we are just trying to replicate reality a little bit more in those two examples. The other oddity here is that the engines are shown with the cowl flaps fully closed. Now again, if you go to the ordinary missions in the game and the engines are being started up and you're ready to taxi, you'll note that the game and the AI has the cowl flaps set to 100% fully open. And again, that is actually the correct position for them. The official kind of training and procedures for starting up the B-17s in reality always had the cowl flaps set to 100%. The reason being is that even while the engines are warming up, if you have the cowl flaps closed to try and accelerate that warming up process, it can actually lead to uneven cooling and hot spots and metal fatigue. And so it is actually important in reality for the cowl flaps to be open, if not in this game, because those kind of things aren't really modeled in this game. And so it's kind of a moot point whether you actually have them open or closed at this stage. But again, I kind of like to try and replicate reality as much as possible. So in the next two examples of this training mission, I will actually go through the process of opening up those cowl flaps. But as I say, in the actual missions in the game, you'll note that those are already 100% open. So it's not something you'll have to really consider when you're playing through the actual missions and you're going to taxi. So let's get through the final two steps of the checklist before we start taxiing, and that is to release the tail wheel lock. You do that by holding down the shift key and tapping T, and that allows the tail wheel to rotate, and that allows us to obviously go through these bends and to turn. And the final piece is to release the parking brake. So hold down the shift key and press P to release the parking brake. So now we're ready to taxi to the end of the runway. Okay, so the first thing to do is to just move your throttle up by a very small amount, maybe about 5 to 10%. 5% to 10%, no more than 10%. And you'll start to see your B-17 moving forward. And just do some small adjustments on that if it's not accelerating quickly enough. Now your target is to taxi around 10 to 15 miles per hour. Now it's okay if you approach some of the bends at say 15 to 20 miles per hour. Because we use the wheel brakes to turn the B-17, you actually slow down as you go through these bends. And don't forget that the wheel brakes, the controls for those are mapped to the same controls as the rudder. So we're accelerating up to this bend. You can see about 17, 18. That's okay. And I just apply the rudder and the wheel brakes to turn us around. And we slowed down quite a lot there. We lost a lot of momentum. So I think the throttle's at a good setting there. I'm just going to let us accelerate up to this bend here. Now this is greater than 90 degrees, so even if we get up to 20 miles per hour, that's perfectly okay. It's very important when you're doing these turns to try and move your rudder slowly and progressively, and don't kind of ram it to an extreme if you can avoid it. If you do kind of run out of momentum when you're making these turns, then just push the throttle up a bit, apply the rudder, the wheel brakes, and make sure you bring the throttle back down again. So we're at the end of the runway, hit the parking brakes to stop us drifting forwards, and then the very first thing you need to do after the parking brakes is to lock the tail wheel. So that's by pressing the T on the keyboard. So that's us lined up nicely for takeoff. Now before we actually go through our takeoff checklist, I just want to comment on the fact that the B-17 is designed for a 3-point takeoff, and the 3-point takeoff is when all three wheels, the two main wheels at the front and the tail wheel, all lift off of the ground simultaneously. And the reason for that is because the B-17 angle that you see here is actually at its most efficient for lift during takeoff. So you want to maintain this angle, this attitude, so that you get the most efficient takeoff. Now if you let the tail come up, you're actually reducing the amount of lift that's being seen on the B-17. And in this game, it actually really won't make any difference at all. The B-17s are extremely easy to take off in this game, but in reality it was an important consideration to make sure that you did the 3-point takeoff. Now we achieved that by pulling back on the joystick slightly once we've hit about 50 or 60 miles per hour. At that speed the tail starts to lift up, and a very small pullback on the joystick will correct that and it'll bring that tail back down. You don't want to overdo it, otherwise you'll greatly increase the drag that the tail wheel is inducing, and that's obviously detrimental to your takeoff. Again, in the game it's not modeled particularly accurately, so it's not that detrimental in the game, but I kind of like to try and keep things as real as possible. So let's run through our checklist for taking off. And again, a very similar one on this simple example to what we did before we started taxiing. We're just going to check our controls again. We're going to go left and right on the joystick, checking the ailerons, forward and back on the joystick, check the elevators, and rotate just to check the rudder. And we've got the parking brake applied, so I'm just going to do a final throttle check up to 50% and back again. So we're good to go. Our flaps are already fully extended, as I touched on earlier, and we're going to start running up the runway. So I'm going to ramp up the throttle to 100%, and once I see the props getting up to full RPM, I'm then going to release the parking brake by holding down the shift key and tapping P. So here we go, 100% throttle, shift P. Now the speed picks up really quickly and that tail lifts very soon, so I'm putting back on the joystick now to stop that lift occurring. And there we go, 3-point takeoff. Now we immediately raise the landing gear by tapping the up key on the keyboard, and I'm letting go of the joystick because we're actually in a fairly steep climb as it is. In fact, I'm going to push forward on the joystick slightly to reduce our relative climb. Now once we're above about 135 miles an hour, we actually want to throttle back slightly. You want to reduce power. And we're about 1,000 feet, we're too high already, so I'm actually going to retract the flaps by pressing the F key on the keyboard. There, that's us. So let's check in the mission debriefing and see if we were successful. Yes, congratulations, you have demonstrated an adequate command of ground handling and takeoff procedures. You have completed this training mission successfully. Now, let's move on and see if we can repeat that with a little bit more of a complex process. Okay, so in this example of taxiing and taking off, just kind of ramp up the difficulty slightly by actually doing the taxiing from inside of the B-17. So using the windows to try and gauge our location on the tarmac as we taxi to the end of the runway. But we'll still run through our external pre-taxi checklist, and we'll do an external pre-takeoff checklist as well. So first of all, let's go to the external view and just run through that right now. So we'll do what we did before in the first example. We'll make sure our throttle is at 0%. Hit the M key to go into manual mode. Check the ailerons, they're moving fine. Check the elevators, up and down, moving fine. And checking rudder movement, and that's working fine. Making sure the parking brake is on, press P. Throttle's up to 50%. Got a response, perfect. Throttle's back down to 0. Okay, so as I said before, there are a couple of things that I want to do before I start taxiing in this case, and one is to retract these wing flaps, and the other is I'm just going to open up the cowl flaps. So let's head back inside the B-17. Let's go to the instrument view for the pilot, and then let's start retracting the wing flaps, and we're going to retract them fully. So we can either do that by using the switch here and right clicking and holding on that switch, or I can just press the M key to go into manual mode first, and then I can press the F key to instruct it to fully retract the flaps. So that's the flaps fully retracted now. Now we're just going to set the cowl flaps to 100% open. We'll do that by left clicking on each one of these. Now if you remember, you've got the game set in, if you've got the game's general difficulty set in medium or high, then doing that will have actually locked you out from having your throttles control the plane. If I move my throttles up now, even though I'm in manual control, I get no response. So we need to put the engines back into your control, or sorry, into the engine management, into AI control, and we do that by right clicking on, let's do it on these turbo levers. So I'm right click, right click, right click, right click. Nothing really happens there, but if I move my throttle control of my joystick up now, see, I get a response, so that's working. So again, it's critical, make sure your throttles are working before you do anything else. And the other thing is that the fuel booster pump should actually be on, and you'll note that again in all of the actual missions you'll fly, you'll notice that the AI will always have these booster pumps on before taxiing and taking off. Now why they're off in this training mission I don't know, but just for the sake of this example I'm actually going to turn them on. So I'm going to press the F5 key to take us to the co-pilot's general view so we can see the fuel pressure here and see the response as we put each one of these switches on. So I've left clicked on 1, pressure's gone up, 2, 3 and 4. And great, we can see the fuel pressure response there. Just make sure my throttles are still working. No, they're not. Activating those switches has locked us out from the throttle control again. So right click, right click, right click, right click. Check the throttles. Yes, okay. So if I go to the external view briefly, what we now see is that the flaps are retracted, cowl flaps are fully open, and we are nearly ready to go. So we'll just go back to the internal view, and we'll go to the pilot's action view. Press M to go back to manual mode, And just look out of the window. And it's this angled view which is the one I'm going to primarily use for checking our movement as we taxi. So make sure the tail wheel lock is off, so I'm going to do that by holding down the shift key and tapping T, and then release the parking brake, shift and P. So now I can do what I did in the first example. I'm just going to move my throttle up by about 5%. I'm going to start looking out the window as we start moving forwards. Again, the key is to do this gently. So I'm going to start my turn now. Again, a bit more throttle. And a very gentle turn. Seems to be going okay. We're going to kind of hug this corner here. Bring our throttle up a little bit to get us round. Throttle back. Now, I think that should be okay. Let's do a quick check on the external view, see where we are. Heck, look at that, that's not bad at all, is it? So, let's run through our pre-takeoff checklist. And so, first of all, we go into manual control again by pressing the M key. We're going to check our controls. First of all, check the ailerons. Yep, movement in those. Elevators. Yep. And rudder movement. Perfect. Now make sure the parking brake is set, and set the tail wheel lock by pressing T. So P for the parking brake, T for the tail wheel lock. Okay, so now we need to just do our final item, which is to partially extend our flaps. In this example, I'm only going to partially extend the flaps to 50%. In reality, you don't really need fully extended flaps for takeoff. And that was certainly a case in reality, even with a fully laden B-17. So I'm just going to go inside now, hit M for manual control again. So when inside, pressing the F1 key, and then M for manual, and then I'm going to press I to go to the instrument view, and I'm now going to press my left mouse button on the flap switch until the indicator there is about 50%. And we'll just go back outside again and just make sure that our flaps look okay. Good. So M for manual mode. One last check on the throttles to make sure they're working fine. Yes, they are. So here we go. So we're going to go for another 3-point takeoff. And here we go. So throttles up to 100%. Release the parking brake. Shift P. And just pull back gently on the joystick to get this 3-point takeoff. There we go. Right, retract the landing gear, pressing the up key on the keyboard. I'm letting go of my joystick now, just giving it a bit of right hand movement just to correct that drift. Speed's going a bit too high, so I'm going to back off slightly. And now we've come up. So we've come up to nearly 1,000 feet, so I'm pressing F to retract the flaps. So I should have actually retracted those just a little bit sooner. And that's it. I think we should have congratulations here. Congratulations again, you have demonstrated an adequate command of ground handling and takeoff procedures. You have completed this training mission successfully. Perfect, so now we can move on to the most difficult one. So in this third and final example of the taxiing and takeoff training mission, I'm actually going to go through the most complex procedure that I use. Now, this is really only applicable if you have the game's general difficulty settings set to high. I tend to use this procedure anyway because I like actually running through the complexities of it and the tone and atmosphere that it generates at the start of each mission. So without further ado, let's get on. I'm going to put this into manual mode by pressing the M key. Then I'm going to press the I key to go to the instrument view. Now here we're just going to correct the two errors that are in the training mission that I highlighted earlier in this video. So first of all, I'm going to turn on the fuel booster pump switches by left clicking on each one. Missed that one there. And then I'm going to open up the cowl flaps to 100%. And then I'm going to retract the flaps by right clicking on the flap switch here, which you could also do by just tapping the F key on the keyboard. Okay, now I will have lost throttle control because I activated these controls using my left mouse button. So if I move my throttle control up, I'm getting no response again. So I'm going to right click on each of these mixture handles. And so now movement of the throttles is functional again. So this really just puts us into the position you should be in a normal mission when you're beginning, and that you've started the engines, and this would be the normal condition that you'd be in. The booster pumps would be on, the cowl flaps would be 100% open, and the wing flaps would be fully retracted. So now let's just take a quick look at the engine temperatures by pressing the F6 key. And the most critical temperature to monitor here is the oil temperature. And let's just hover over that, and we can see that the oil temperature in each engine is around the 35-degree mark. Now, I think in reality it was acceptable for you to take off a B-17 when the oil temperature was 40 degrees or above. Now in this game the minimum temperature has been set to 60 degrees, and if you apply full power to the engines when the temperature is below 60 degrees, the game does model damage being applied to those engines. So it's critical when you have your game's general difficulty settings set to high that you ensure you do not take off and apply full power to the engines until the oil temperature has reached 60 degrees. The other temperatures are less critical. I don't think, in fact I know that they don't actually cause damage to the engines high revs when those temperatures are below their optimal levels. So oil temperature is the key one to monitor here. It's perfectly fine to taxi with a low oil temperature as long as you keep the revs down. So without further ado, let's start our taxiing. And we're going to go to an external view by pressing the F2 key. I'm going to take the easy method of taxiing in this instance. So just move around. So before we go, make sure your throttle is set to 0. I'm going to go into manual mode by pressing M. Make sure our parking braker is on by pressing the P key. Now let's just run through our pre-taxi checklist. So let's make sure our controls are functioning. So I'm going to check the ailerons first, moving joystick left to right. That's good. Elevators, joystick forward and back. And then the rudder, rotating right, rotating left. So all of those are working fine. Now just going to increase the throttle to about 50% very briefly. And great, we've got a response there. So everything is functioning. So now we can commence our taxi. So release the parking brake, Shift P, release the tail wheel lock, Shift T. Now I'm going to bring the throttle up about 5–10%. And here we go. So as I said in the previous sections, just use gentle and progressive movements of your rudder or your steering brakes. Try and avoid large movements, otherwise you can actually end up overturning, or oversteering I should say, and you actually can swing the B-17 in the wrong direction. You can actually greatly overshoot due to the momentum of the plane. So again, trying to keep the speed down to an absolute maximum of 20 miles per hour. So I've just throttled back slightly there because I was definitely going to exceed it, and I have again, so I'm throttling back a wee bit more. Now I am turning for our spot at the end of the runway. So I'm just bringing the throttle back up a little bit there. There we go. Back on the throttle to 0. Just rotate the view, make sure we've got a good line on the runway. We do. So parking brakes on, press P, and tail wheel locked, press T. Okay, so now we're going to head back inside and check the engine temperatures. So F1 to go inside and F6 again there. Now let's check the oil temperatures, and we're getting there up to 56 degrees, so we're not far off. So just to accelerate the warming process of the engines up, I'm just going to bring the throttle up so that the RPM comes up to about 1200. So just a small increase in the throttle by pressing M first of all to come out into manual mode, and then bringing the throttles up slightly. So we're about 1200 RPM, and we just now need to monitor these temperatures until they exceed 60 degrees. So it's going to take a few minutes, so I'm just going to pause there, and I'll be back with you folks in a moment. Okay, so that took about another 3 to 4 minutes of heating up, warming up time, and so I can now show you the oil temperatures come out of the blue, and we've reached 60 degrees more or less across the board there. So as long as all of the oil temperatures are indicating 60 or above, and they're no longer showing as blue, they're showing as amber or green, then you're good to go. Again, we'll just check the cylinder head temperatures, make sure they are still in the amber region at least, and they are. And the carburetor air temperatures, we'll just double check here. Again, they're now in the amber region. So perfect. Carburetor air temperature minimum is 15 degrees. And the minimum for the cylinder head temperature is 150. But a low cylinder head temperature doesn't actually lead to damage in the engine, certainly within in-game, the way it's been modelled in here. And the same thing with the carburetor air temperature. If that is a little bit too low, that is not going to actually model any damage to the engines. It's only the oil temperature, if that is below 60, and you put high revs on the engines, will the game actually model damage. So it looks like we're ready to go. So I'm just going to throttle back on the engines again, bring that back down to 0, and I'm going to do an instrument takeoff here, just to demonstrate the instrument readings that you should be looking for through the takeoff process. So now we're ready to go through our pre-takeoff checklist. So we're just going to switch to the exterior view, and we're just going to press N for manual control again, and we're just going to check the joystick responses once more. So aileron check, that's good, they're moving. Elevator check, it's moving. Rudder check, that's moving. And we'll just do one final check on the throttles. Double check the parking brake is applied first, pressing P, bringing the throttles up to 50% and back again. And we got a response there on all 4 engines. So we're good to go. So let's head back inside. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do an instrument only takeoff now, just to ramp up the difficulty, but also just to show you the instrument values that you should be looking for throughout the takeoff process. Now the key parameters here are obviously speed, which I'll be using the speed indicator on the overlay here. We'll be looking at the climb rate, and you want that climb rate to basically move on up to around 2, and you want to try and hold it around the 2 level there. And obviously the gyro horizon is your key piece here to make sure that you're flying straight. So let's get moving. So we are ready to go. Press M for manual mode. The tail wheel is locked, so you can see that light is on there. So we're going to push up the throttle to 100%. Shift P to take off the parking brakes, and then the speed's coming up. I'm just going to gently pull back on the control stick here to keep the tail wheel down for 3-point takeoff. And there we go, the climb rate's increasing, so I'm now going to retract the landing gear. Now speed's a bit too high, so I'm just going to throttle back slightly. Climbing a bit too much, the climb rate has increased to about 4, so I'm going to push back on the control stick and bring that over to the right slightly. Now we're approaching 1,000 feet, so I'm going to retract the flaps. So I'm pressing F to retract the flaps, and perfect. It looks like we actually succeeded very quickly there. So let's just read the mission debriefing. Excellent, congratulations again. So I hope this has been useful for you. There are 3 different examples. I may have missed a few points, but I hope that has been useful regardless. Now, just one thing to consider, that when you are doing this in a real mission, you'll obviously be increasing above 1,000 feet. And as you do, the next thing in the takeoff procedure would be to close the cowl flaps. Anyway, so that's it, folks. Please like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.